next up, a couple norms just so that we kind of know what to expect. Everybody's been great with mute, but we're gonna have time for a Q&A and some open questions, which you could add in the chat or unmute, up to you, open-ended there. And also look out for some links in the chat. I'm gonna be adding a few Notion pages and a Notion template that's kind of a model for relating databases. So yeah, just keep an eye on the chat if you've got a full screen. So if we haven't crossed paths before, my name's Dave. I'm, as I mentioned, based in Miami. Grew up here, moved back in 2020 in the start of the pandemic. We all have a pandemic story, I'm sure, but have a kind of a diverse background. So I actually started working and studying in architecture, and then started a digital agency, got into teaching, and started Notion Consulting in 2021. But pretty much like on the side, like after having created YouTube content and walked through blog posts, people here and there would reach out for like coaching sessions. And it wasn't until like getting the certified Notion kind of certification that at the start of this year that a lot of more leads came in from the beginning of the year onward through today, and kind of allowed me to, jump in full time. So, but before that, at the beginning of this year, I was actually teaching full time. So teaching 5 courses, running an after school STEM program, and in these little bits and pieces of time, coaching with entrepreneurs, and started working with companies that were anywhere from like 5 people to 80 people, and really trying to navigate all that. Definitely not sustainable, but was helpful to make the transition into consulting from teaching, which I do and still love, teaching and working with people and helping people on anything from technology to systems thinking. But I really relied on systems to not necessarily have to think about what I was working on or what was highest priority, and kind of have Notion to thank for a lot of that, to be able to schedule without burning out or without getting overwhelmed too much, at least. So yeah, that was up until this past June. So looking ahead, very excited about a few things coming up this year, but the next kind of big launch is going to be the relaunch of Manifest OS. And let me know if in the chat if you've come across it, or if you've used it or downloaded it at any point in the past. But this is supposed to be kind of a workspace, a dashboard for minimalist productivity. So how you can organize different levels of data, from managing projects to habits to routines, without having an overly complex dashboard. So figuring out how to do that in a way that's not overwhelming. The reason I'm most excited about that is because Notion, if you've noticed, has released a lot of new and exciting features on everything from visuals, on having icon libraries, to being able to visualize progress bars. So a lot of these features definitely make Notion more accessible and easier to use, while also providing more information on everything from progress on goals to visually organizing different areas or different types of projects. So this re-release of Manifest is also going in a different direction, where it's focusing more on dashboards. So if we're going to be looking at Business HQ today, but really focusing in on dashboards as a way to kind of have areas that are maybe not using every single database, and allows users to get a sense of what's possible if I'm managing a content creation system, or if I'm managing my goal setting. So it's really meant to be a space for looking at examples, and then also being public, where people can post questions and get some walkthroughs for users, so being a little bit more interactive. Also in October, launching a live 2-week course. This is going to be my first live course. So was fortunate enough to join the startup called Maven. So they have a course accelerator that's right now application only, and kind of was a boot camp for creating and launching a course and using best practices in terms of education and keeping students engaged, getting a lot of feedback on your course. So that's been pretty exciting. But that 2-week course is really going to be focused on maximizing productivity. So how do we focus as much time and energy as possible on our most creative work, and spend as little time as possible on these low leverage tasks that are really not moving the needle for your business or for your work. So, and I'll drop a link in the chat if anybody's kind of interested in learning more when when it launches August 29th. So keep a lookout for that in the chat. And then the last thing is Notion Creators Community. This is something that some of you in the chat have been in a few channels in the Notion Creators Community, which has been like kind of a beta test of putting course content and using conversations and getting a sense of how to best use that community platform on Circle. So that's going to be opening up later in the year for everybody. And it's really meant to be a space to go from loading templates to and watching, videos and webinars to engaging with other Notion creators and trying to get ideas or get feedback on how you're using Notion or how you're trying to use it so that we can kind of level up in terms of, our productivity levels in Notion. Cool. So then this is just kind of like a work in progress page, but these are the areas that we're focusing on for the live course in October. Things like that are probably the most important, building our own workflows and understanding the process of how to do that and how to design workspaces that are for maximum focus. Key thing is preventing burnout, which as a creator or as an entrepreneur, this is very much top of mind because we wear so many hats. So just a few notes on that. So big question, why we're using Notion or thinking about using Notion for business. If we think about organizing information, there's a lot of moving parts, right? So when we decide to start a business or a new venture, we're kind of hit with that inspiration bug where we've got ideas, we're mood boarding, we're getting inspiration from all over, and excitement is kind of at its peak. So, this is where we're just trying to harness all of our ideas at the very front end. And then, maybe it's a couple weeks or a couple months, but, reality sets in a little bit in terms of understanding all the other facets of running a business on everything from taking payments to managing meetings to booking discovery calls. And this is the period where a lot of creators and entrepreneurs can get very overwhelmed very quickly. So, this is a common thing and is something that I've navigated through moving from teaching to entrepreneurship and consulting, and really relied on Notion to organize information so that we do prevent overwhelm and we have a clear idea of what our next actions are, at any given time. And once we start to see all the things that we need to track and manage as an entrepreneur, this is sometimes a response. At least in my case, it could be. So, what we want to do is prevent this, and instead of having that potential burnout always kind of on the horizon, instead having an idea of having a plan of how we're growing our business, how we're managing it, and making sure that we're spending as much time and energy as possible on the work that we were most excited about when we started that business. So rather than have these other things kind of quickly take over and, overrule all the important work, we want to have systems that counter that. So when we think about Notion, the best way that I found it described is it helps us find the right information exactly when we need it. So when we start to do things like organize information in databases and start to connect databases together, this kind of like levels up workspaces where we are always filtering information so that we're only seeing the most topical documents or resources or tasks and never really seeing the whole picture, which allows us to focus in on the highest priority task at that given moment. So, and one of the exercises we're going to do today is going to be looking at how to do that and how that might work. And then another key thing is minimizing what we're calling low leverage actions. So when we think of tasks that are not really moving the ball forward for our business or are repetitive tasks that could be automated, these low leverage tasks can end up taking up the majority of our time, really leaving little to no time and energy for your most creative work. And if you follow Kehi on Twitter or in his newsletter, he calls this like the 10K work. So like there's a $10, $100, $1,000 and 10K work, and really thinking about how do we automate all the things that are not 10K work so that we have time and energy for that most important and most valuable work. All right, so quick poll. While we're switching gears to get into this exercise, I just want to get a sense of from everybody, where you're at currently. So you should see a poll on your screen, but question is really being, what's the highest priority for you today in terms of these 4 categories? So while we're doing that, we're going to take 1 or 2 minutes for that, and then I'm going to be setting up a little Notion exercise, and I'll share a link for that in the chat. Take a couple more minutes, or sorry, not. Take a couple more seconds for that before we switch gears. And while we're wrapping up the poll, I'm sharing this Notion exercise in the chat. So this is the dashboard design framework. So we're going to be using this to kind of go through an example of how we could start to think about our workspace from beginning to end. And we use a version of this at the Notion Coach with new clients or companies that are migrating to Notion, and trying to get a sense of what's trying to be managed in Notion and what are highest priority items in terms of organization. So we're going to do that next. So if you open up that link in the chat and you go to the top right, you should have a duplicate button. So if you don't, or if it's not showing up, definitely let me know in the chat. So I want to make sure everybody can duplicate it and have a version to save for your own use. All right, so poll results just to see what we're doing. All right, so it looks like increasing productivity is definitely at the top, followed by generally getting better, leveling up in Notion, and then followed by focus and last burnout. Cool. What's interesting has been doing a similar poll in Instagram and Twitter has brought almost the exact same results. So it's super interesting in terms of, having that consistency across platforms. Okay, so we're gonna go into this first. We've got 3 areas that I want to cover, but when we think about setting up our workspace specifically for business, the very first step we take, whether it's a solopreneur, a 5-person team, or an 80-person team, we really just start with listing out what are the things that we're trying to track. And as we get into more and more detail, that becomes the blueprint for how we set up our workspace. So we're gonna do a version of this together, and then you can definitely kind of take this, spend more time with it, and if you have an existing workspace, you can kind of compare it to where you're at currently and see if there's any ways to improve your current workspace. So this is a version of a map that I did for an earlier project this year. But even before this step, there was a bullet pointed list of all the things that we're tracking, what aspects of these areas are we tracking. So for example, with the product team, thinking of things like meeting notes, projects that are happening within those teams, and really starting to get an understanding of, for our business in particular, what are the workflows and what are the processes that you're doing, and how can we start to organize those pieces of information in a way that makes the most sense. So because a lot of us are solopreneurs, creators, freelancers, leading small teams, this process ends up looking very differently. So it's very hard to apply a kind of prepackaged template that maybe doesn't fit your specific workflow, which is kind of why it's kind of so critical to go through a process like this for yourself. So when we look at the dashboard design framework, we're just going to go through an example on how this works, and then you can kind of like spend a little bit more time with it. But if we start with defining key areas, let's say for my business, the most important elements of my day-to-day is managing projects, let's say tasks, and then we can say notes, for example. We're probably tracking more of these things, but we're trying to prioritize like 2 or 3 elements to be front and center in our workspace. So from there, the next section is starting to identify information that we're trying to track. So when we start to organize information in databases, this part of the process ends up being pretty critical to decide, do I want to track things like due dates? So what I'm going to do here is change this from projects, tasks, and notes. And from here, the next step is going to be trying to think through information that you use to track things like projects. So if I track due dates, for example, priority levels, if I want to track tasks for each project, say by project. And then also, if you've got any ideas or recommendations on things that you track for any of these, definitely let me know in the chat to get some ideas going in terms of other properties that we have. Sadiq says KPIs, awesome. So key performance indicators, if we're using that to drive decision-making on projects, that could be super helpful. All right, so got some for those. Let's say for tasks, we've got the most common one being status. So not started, in progress, done, that type of thing. If we have a, due date, or let's say due date here, but that could be completion date, that could be deadline, depending on what's most comfortable. And then other properties for tasks could be any, say, related documents or examples. Maybe I like to write out descriptions for tasks just to kind of give myself some more context as to what's done. Not Manaya or Manya, sorry, I hope I said that right. We're gonna change this to done by. That's better. Cool. So we've got those. Again, this is probably looking differently based on what you're trying to track, but the key goal here is to not over-engineer your workspace or your databases, because that's the first step to it becoming overwhelming and maybe unusable. So for notes, maybe this is something where you're quickly jotting down notes related to projects, but maybe not related to projects. So this could be organized by tags or notebooks, maybe organized by created date, if you want to go back and quickly filter. One thing that is pretty common is tagging as an inbox. So if you have a quick capture system for organizing notes, you could have that. So a couple examples there to kind of get our ideas going. And then I also like to put an overview here. Cool. So, all right, next up, what information do we need to see? So when we think about projects, tasks, notes, we're thinking through, and we're just gonna jump into an example from here. But for this exercise, if you do kind of take this on independently, there's some steps here to go from this outline to a 1.0 of your workspace to get a sense of how do we translate this into, a Notion dashboard, for example. But things like creating a new page, creating databases, which we'll do now. So while we're switching gears to this next part, I want to talk quickly about databases, because when we look at a lot of resources available, especially like from the Notion template library, they largely organize different sets of pages visually, but very few templates leverage databases unless we get into some of the more premium templates, like, if we're building a second brain or using the para method. But also when we get into those premium templates, these databases are connected in ways that may not be easy to understand, which is why I always recommend, even if you're using a template as a source of inspiration, trying to build or reverse engineer systems that you tend to prefer or like, just to be able to make those decisions on what's being connected in your workspace. And also make sure that there's nothing in there that's not really relevant to you or useful. So I always go back to this James Clear quote that we think we're often lacking motivation, but it's more likely clarity. And when we think about organizing information, that could bring the clarity that we need to put our best foot forward when it comes to doing our most creative work and doing highly motivated work. So from there, I want to jump to an example where we set up this space and start to organize a project in a few different ways. And this is just kind of a preview of the upcoming manifest, but this space is entirely new. So when we think about dashboards, these are kind of end-to-end templates of how we would approach things like CRM, a business HQ, our goals hub, etc. And the kind of things that we've probably seen before, specifically databases for these key areas. Had to take a sip of water there for a second. So we're gonna jump into the business HQ, and again, this is one example. Workspaces look very different. And Jamal, the quote, I think it's from Nathan Barry from ConvertKit. Oh, Atomic Habits, sorry. I was thinking about something else. Yeah, so that was from Atomic Habits. Amazing book. If you haven't read it, definitely recommend it. Very habits focused, but also applies to things like how we work and setting up routines and getting 1% better every day. A lot of big takeaways from that book. So we have a business HQ, and to dive into how this is organized, we're going to jump into an example project and start to see what we're tracking for that project and how we can start to filter these databases to show only the information that we need. So if we, let's say, go into this webinar project, we have a couple things here that I want to briefly go over, and there's a lot of other connections that are maybe not super relevant to today, but could be helpful to get a sense of. So if I expand these properties, we have things like area. So if you are tracking personal things, work related, if you have multiple side hustles, grouping them by area could be helpful to be able to silo these projects a little bit more detailed. Juan, 100% para method all the way, projects, areas, resources, archives. That was, I think, like Marie Poulin's videos were like pretty game changing a couple years back in terms of understanding what you can do in Notion. But priority level, this is something that some people use and some people don't, but identifying, what's highest priority if you're going into the following week and you want to focus in on one or two particular projects, we would kind of set this to higher priority. Scheduling projects, if we go based off of David Allen's definition, the writer of Getting Things Done, any group of tasks that has a clear beginning or end date and typically doesn't take more than a year to complete. If it takes more than a year, it's probably an area and not a project. And then a short description, this could be helpful just to, in your own words, describe what's the goals for the project, what do you want to get out of it, etc. Status, so definitely having a not started, in progress, and done. And then we have some other connections. Anytime we see that up right arrow, that's another database that's connected. But if we go into the page, there are 3 key areas as an example to get your ideas going, where if we open up this project page and we're doing work related to this project in particular, we're actually just filtering these databases to only show things that are relevant to this project. So for example, this actions view of this database is filtered to this project. So second thing about databases is once we start to set up templates, we save ourselves a lot of time setting up a project, organizing information, and can automate a lot of these tasks. Whether you're in Notion or whether you're in other tools, it's not really Notion's, not limited to Notion, but using technology to never start from scratch and never start from a blank slate. But if we go into tasks, we can also start to populate these tasks with information. So we're going to take a look at that next in terms of setting up a template for a project and then giving yourself a quick kind of sequence of mini tasks to complete that will again require less thinking and less cognitive load deciding, okay, what exactly goes into a YouTube thumbnail, for instance. And then when we look at the actions database, we can see that there's slightly different properties being tracked for actions. So we might have due date, the time needed. This is something that has been super valuable personally in terms of having an idea of, or an estimate of how much time something's going to take, so that in a weekly review, I can see, well, this estimate was way off, or these days, was far less productive than earlier in the week, for example. So again, it's all about deciding what data do you want to capture in your workspace that's going to help you do work better and more effectively. And then also tagging, if you, for example, have a content creation calendar, tagging any actions that are social media related allows you to see what was posted when. That's all part of the business HQ as well. But you kind of get the sense of, we could track quite a bit and provide some context for ourselves or for our teams so that we're never starting from zero. And then in this area to the right, we had mentioned in that exercise tracking things like notes. So if we go back into, give me 1 second. So if we go back into the home page, there's a section called Notes and Notebooks. So these are 2 databases that are pretty closely tied together. But this is a place to quickly capture ideas. So if we were to look at this filter, this is filtering our notes to anything that's webinar related would show up here on the right. So if we're thinking about notes that we took, or if we clipped a portion of a podcast and dropped it into our notes, this would show up as part of this project for reference, again, being able to have that quickly accessible from this project space. So the goal here is preventing navigating through different databases and trying to search for exactly the right information that you need through a quick set of filters or tags or properties. We can kind of do all that work up front to avoid that whole process. And then for library, this is also something that's part of the system, but as we're organizing and saving links from the web or podcasts or highlights from Kindle books, having a space to organize that cohesively also allows us to be able to filter it in unique ways. So I could connect this particular project to any resource in the library so that they also show up here for quick reference. Good question from Colin in terms of, does areas work for businesses? So short answer is yes. We've managed to set up different areas. We do call them a little bit differently, either teams or departments. But when we think about managing projects or documents, kind of works the same way in terms of having a marketing team, support team, product team, and really acting as a one level in from the company or organization's workspace to be able to filter this information a bit more clearly. Great question. So this is just to get a sense of how we can manage a project and what information we could bring in. But what I want to do next is create a template for this project. So if we move ahead a little bit, if anybody's familiar with Jack Butcher, I just kind of like reworked one of his most common statements, but the idea that we're building something once and automating it twice or more. So when we think about projects that we take on, a lot of times the core actions that are tied to that project are pretty similar. So if I'm thinking back to working in architecture, a concept design phase, nine times out of 10, those steps are going to be pretty similar. There's always some variability, but there's common threads in the projects that we tend to take on as business owners or creators. And if we're organizing these things in Notion, there's ways to create templates for projects where we're bringing all this information in automatically without having to think about it, and just kind of through the click of a button, which we're going to look at next. But this also brings up something that I kind of go back to with clients and coaching clients, that this is an iterative process. And when we think about where we started in terms of our exercise, this is meant to be a way to make decisions on what information you want to track and how you can start to build these systems for your own use or for your team's use. So let's get into building a template for a project so that we have enough time for any questions or comments that come up, and then we could wrap up. So we have this project. This is taken pretty closely from my actual project in terms of tasks, but let's say we want to create a webinar project template. So if we go back into, let's go back into our homepage, and we're gonna go back into Business HQ, because this has the two databases that we're using or referencing the most. So in here, just for context, we're looking at the project's database. So I'm just gonna turn on the database title for both of these. And we're gonna create a project template for webinars. So I'm gonna go into here, into this dropdown, and we're gonna call this webinar project template. I'm just gonna go ahead and give this icon while we're here. If you haven't played around with this is a 1-week-old feature in terms of Notion's icon library, but pretty excited about that. And then if you have a color coding system, for example, for me, anything content related is purple. We can also give this an area. So if we say that this is community related, anything that's project specific, we want to leave blank because this is a template that we're going to be reusing over and over. So we've got that template set up, but I want to go back into this existing project, and we're going to highlight all of these tasks. So if we're thinking through the workflow, I haven't created any templates. I'm just managing tasks for this project as I go along the project. But then as I'm getting closer to the end of the project, I want to turn this into a template. So we're going to highlight all of these, and we're going to click on any one of them. Let's say we'll right click and then duplicate. We'll give that a moment. They're all kind of going to done. Let me make sure they load. And then what I'm going to do next is we're going to move this to the webinar. We're going to search for webinar project template here. I think I saw it show up here. And what that's going to do is move these tasks into that template. So let's go back into the template page, and then I'm going to click edit. So we'll see that those are here, but I want to do a few more steps to get these as part of this project template. So I'm going to make this full screen. And if you notice, even if we took those actions out of the database, they still retain any information that was part of the task. So this is super helpful if we're adding notes around tasks, if you're linking to resources, we could retain all of that information in this view. So the next thing we're going to do is, because the actions and projects databases are related already, we could click linked view of database, and then I'm going to select action. We'll change this from a table view to a board view. And then instead of grouping by priority, we're going to group by status. So we're going to change the grouping to status, and then that looks correct here. But if you notice, this is bringing in every action and it's not quite filtered. So another big benefit of using databases is we could filter by this template. So what does that mean? If we go into filter by, let's look for projects, instead of selecting an existing or a real project, I could select, I only want to filter to this template. So what that's going to do is every time I use this template, it's going to automatically filter, so I don't have to set this up manually. And then from here, we've got these actions set up. Let's make this a little bit bigger so it's easier to see. And then maybe I want to show not only the name, but let's say I want to see the due date and any tags are associated with those tasks. So our inclination might be, oh, let me just drag these tasks into this filtered view. The issue there is it's always going to be connected to the template. So if we make changes, it's going to change the template. So what we're going to do instead is we're going to put this in a toggle. We're just going to call this tasks for this project type. I'm going to highlight all of these and drop those in here so that we have those saved for later. Give this a little bit of space here. All right. And then in addition, if we go back to that exercise, if you use notes or if you want to reference library materials, this would be the place to set up that view where we're creating a linked view of that database. Give me 1 second. All right. So last step before we can discuss. Now that we have this template set up, we're going to go back into Business HQ, and I want to create a new webinar for one that's happening in September. So I'm going to go into here. We could either select it from this dropdown, or you can just click new, any one of these buttons. Even if we select this one, you'll have the option to change this project into a template that you've set up. So we're going to use this one, and we're going to call this course launch webinar. And then from here is where we would start to add any properties that are specific to this webinar. So things like priority, if we have a schedule, let's say that's starting Monday and end date will be September 15th. Description, share what the course is about. Not started yet, so we can maybe set this to upcoming if you get more granular with your status properties. And then from here, what we can do is drag all of these tasks that are from that previous webinar project and drop them into not started. And now we've got our roadmap for this webinar, that we could reuse. And if we, go through this webinar project for September and start to identify, oh, I, use this template in Canva, or I kind of have this template for how I'm describing events, we could go back into that template. So we go back into projects, go in here, and then we could go back and edit any one of these tasks and add more information or more context so that we're, again, never starting from scratch. So when we think about where this could be applicable or helpful, this could apply to everything from, your sales process to content creation to social media, and starting to define what are the steps that I tend to take, 9 times out of 10 for that project type, to start to think through all of the things that you can do up front to save time on, setting up your Figma file for your thumbnail or setting up your Canva file, having all those things done as much as possible in advance. So, I know we did a big jump from the dashboard design framework to that example, but even if you're using or starting with a template, still useful to go through the process of not only what functions do you want to organize, but key properties that you want to track in relation to those functions. So with that said, let me jump back to the slide real quick. So with that said, some of these actions you might track in Notion, and you might find that for things like CRM, for example, you graduate to another program that does that one thing a lot better. And that's also a common process. And what I tend to suggest for small companies or growing companies that are not quite ready to use a suite of 30 tools is tracking things in Notion as a starting point, as a way to decide, if I'm creating a CRM, what do I want to track with these interactions with potential clients or customers before taking on a new tool, because at that point, there's a clear understanding of what you're tracking, what the workflow looks like, and the learning curve is a lot lower. So with that said, this is really only one aspect of the manifest update that's coming in a few weeks. But when we think about setting goals, somebody mentioned KPIs and goal tracking, that's a key part of it as well. But the new manifest, I think the big difference is that this is almost a proof of concept where you could explore the different ways that databases could be connected, but ultimately leaving it to you to decide if you're really focusing on business and not really prioritizing like tracking your routine or creating a daily planner. It gives a model for how to focus in on these key areas. So these are the sections that are currently being built out, including the original manifest. So that's also in progress, but also leveraging, the updates to progress bars that just came out in the past couple weeks, as well as the new icon library. So again, little updates and improvements that help us visually organize information so that we could, again, focus on the highest priority tasks and our most creative work. So with that said, I'm just gonna leave it there to see if there's any questions or comments, whether it's on the dashboard framework or the template in general. Border to the dashboard title. Great question. So Noah, are you referring to like this area here? Cool. So this is actually a call out. So if we go into, I go into this space and I want to, we have the typical like H1 heading, which is the largest. The reason I like to use the call out is it just kind of gives us the ability to choose an icon. So if I'm creating like a reference or an informational note for a client dashboard, I can add that here. And you can also change the color. So I can, if you've got a color coding system, you can set that up there. All right, so Philippe asked, do you use one main database for everything or several and then you relate? Great question. So if we go into this section, these are all databases. So there's some areas where you probably want to consolidate. For example, in actions. Actions encompasses tasks, meetings, deliverables, really as like one main database to track everything that's being done for a project. Mainly because if we have a meetings database, a tasks database, and they're all connected to projects, it could just get overwhelming really quickly. So grouping these by action really helps to kind of consolidate every piece of information related to a project. Got a few more. Do you have an example of showing via Notion work for clients? I do. I'm trying to see if there's any that are kind of public to show. Let me see if I could find something. Actually, what I can do is go into one of these. this up. So this framework, in some cases, like if it's a team between 50 and 100 people where we've got specific departments, has worked pretty well as a starting point. So again, we're thinking about a team where this is the highest level workspace before we jump into team dashboards. But looking at things like company pages, like employee handbooks and things like that, news, whether it's internal or external about the company. And then from here, we jump straight into teams. So for example, opening any one of these, let's say if we open the business operations team, there's spaces within that team that are really more focused pages to organize things like contracts, finance, analytics. But the only difference between a bigger company and a smaller company is there is a little bit more granularity in terms of like hierarchy. So you have a higher level workspace that's not really commonly used. What happens is people tend to jump straight into the team department or workspace. And then tracking things like active projects, a space to meet the team if it's a remote company, and then also organizing all of the high level databases in their own area. So this is mostly to kind of protect the databases and make sure that we don't accidentally move them, or we've got high level databases in different places. So for companies, if it's more than 5 people, having a space that houses all of the high level databases just to kind of keep them. Hope that's helpful as an example without kind of showing too much about client dashboards or workspaces. Cool, let me see what else we got. Question, so Mac, what is Manifest V4? So Manifest is a template that I released, or there's 3 versions now, but it's meant to be kind of a personal productivity dashboard and tracking everything from your like using it as a daily planner to a project manager, and for people who are tracking things on everything from journal entries to projects, a space to do that in a straightforward way. So, and just to get a sense of the previous version, which is the most up-to-date version, there's a quick capture space for quickly logging notes, actions, journal entries, and then it automatically filters to the current week. So if you're tracking habits, you can see how you're doing for the current week. And then also rolling up data into weeks, months, and quarters. So, this is kind of more of like a personal planning area. And then for actions, this is meant to organize all your active projects to see what actions are next up or highest priority across different projects, as well as the projects themselves. So, using the timeline view, being able to see what's active, what are some upcoming due dates, things like that. So areas to the previous point, some most common examples like a personal area, business, learning, health, content creation, to be able to then filter those projects and filter those documents, things like that. Cool, let me see so Mac or Juan, if you're interested in it and you haven't used it yet, I'd probably hold off until I launch the new one, because it's gonna have a lot more updates and I think it's gonna be a lot more helpful. All right, let me see what other questions we got. Cool, so Colin asks how I use Notion as a personal dashboard and for business. That's a great question. Let me open up my view of my space. That's an example. And 1 second. Cool. So for context, this is my personal workspace. So this has all of the high-level databases, and then this area is essentially like a navigation menu, so I can quickly jump to specific areas. So things like my inbox, which has a space for quickly jotting down like to-dos, any notes, things like that. And this is probably more useful on the phone where I've got these favorited in my sidebar. But then I have a separate area for a Notion Coach work that is its own area. And if I open this up here, let me open this up for more. So this is an area, so we can see here it's part of the areas database, and this has high-level pages for quick reference, like financial stuff, copy for the website, and then these toggles have workspaces that are shared with each client or company. So any one of these will open up our own workspace that we could track projects and tasks. So they're pretty closely connected. I think I do spend a lot of time in this view and specifically in the client workspaces view, but the highest level organization, encompasses kind of all of these databases. And then the planner, for instance, this is a view of my daily planner database. And then this is looking at actions that are tagged with today as a due date. So this little number here, which I've been exploring as of late, is a sum of minutes. So for the time estimate, so I know like if I'm trying to stay under 240 minutes, if it is way beyond that, then I know I have to kind of reschedule some stuff or like move some tasks around. And in the planner, same thing. There's also a weekly review process. So this is just looking at going back to the KPIs and OKR conversation, tracking your progress toward your goals. So if you set up goals on a quarterly basis or an annual basis, this will give you a quick sense of like, maybe it's weekly or bi-weekly, where you're just kind of making these updates and seeing, okay, where am I doing really well and where do I need to spend and invest more time? So, but again, these are all, evolutions over time. So for context, this is looking at the key results database, so which is also tied to projects and is also feeds up to quarterly objectives. So just to get a sense of how that works. Cool. So, Juan, yeah, I'll zoom in on the system. So yeah, for context, these are kind of like all the high level ones, and I know that the template has a few more and is worked slightly differently. Ali, yes, so that's one of the big changes. So if you noticed the progress bars and the key results, these are kind of like manually created formulas. So the new progress bars kind of streamlines this quite a bit. So that's one of the key updates for the new manifest. And to S Merchant's question, yes. So when we get into weeks, let me go back into the to-date view, for instance. All of these are filtered to either the current day or week. So this has date is today, so this will update automatically every day. And also the actions database as well. So this is filtered to today, and then pretty much everything that's not personal tasks, just because, to give an estimate of any work related tasks in terms of time. And then same thing goes for tomorrow, and like this week has all the days. So for example, let me just close these. So this is grouped slightly differently because this is using a formula. So I just want to say, are these actions this week? And it's grouping. So if I go into group, it's grouping by due date and specifically the date and chronologically. So this will also update automatically. So once we get to Sunday, kind of kicks off a new week, and then I can see that week's tasks. So a couple other questions, and make sure I got to everybody. And I know we're a little over, so if you have to go, it's totally fine. Thanks for joining, but let's see what we got. Different sets of databases. So short answer is no. So for example, projects are all in my projects database. One limitation or one kind of, area that could be a challenge is when we, for example, in like the Notion Coach area, there needs to be separate workspaces or dashboards for each client. So if I'm sharing tasks or information for that client, kind of needs to be in a separate space from my personal, just to kind of have that barrier so that you're not oversharing information from other projects. But for the most part, I'm using my personal dashboard and then filtering for any views that I need to share with clients or collaborators. Yeah, so quick note on Manifest. If I go back to the timeline, let's go back here. So that's actually launching in about 4 weeks time. So definitely early, but yeah, that's just mainly accounting for all of the updates that have come to Notion. And one key difference between the last one and the current, if I go back to the template in particular, is there's a space for walkthroughs and tutorials. So if we go back in here, this is also something that's being built out over the next couple weeks. But as Notion releases updates, as questions come in from users, there's been, I think from the past 3 versions, there's been over, 1,400 downloads. But a lot of questions come in that are usually via email. And one big change that I'm trying to focus on is making sure that as questions come up, making those resources available to everybody who's using it, so that we have more of a knowledge base around doing things like using Readwise to organize library articles, or how to do a weekly review, things like that. So that's just one of the key changes. It really just making this stuff more accessible. But yeah. And Mac, to your question, using it as a CRM, if you're not using something already, it could be useful to get everything in there and start to organize. I'm working on for 2 different clients, setting that up for their workspace. And what I typically recommend is once we get to the point where you need to automatically update contacts based on emails or phone calls, that might be a moment where a CRM specific tool might work better. So something to keep in mind there. And then Taylor, that's a good question. That's locked. Oh, so that might be because it needs to be duplicated. So once you duplicate the template, then that becomes part of your workspace and you can edit, however you see fit. All right, so one last area. This is again an example, a model of how you might connect databases. So this is a goal tracker that I released recently, but I'm gonna drop this into the chat as well. And this is free to duplicate for everybody, but really just a proof of concept in terms of creating goals, and then from there starting to define what metrics we want to connect to those goals, things like that. So, hope that's helpful in terms of looking at how you can connect databases in the future. But yeah, in the meantime, just want to quickly plug, these are the things that we're working on, and we're probably going to have future webinars later this year around the new manifest, the course launch, and the community. So, and these are going to be all tied together. So people that are downloading the manifest template are going to have their own channel in the community, in addition to the live course students who will have their own focus area, which will probably have more like office hours type sessions. But it's kind of a piece by piece process, but really just moving us from, we're excited about Notion, we've played around with some templates, moving from that level to getting to the point where we could design our own workspaces that are really optimized for our own work and our own goals, and really getting to that level. I think from there, kind of the opportunities are endless. And when we think of the time that's saved and the energy that's saved when we've got these systems set up exactly the way we want them, just could be hugely valuable and could, accelerate our businesses and work. So yeah, that's just a quick overview of that. And in the meantime, I'll send a follow-up email with the recording. And then also, if you got any feedback or if you have any follow-up questions, definitely feel free to send me a message. You can just drop my email there. And yeah, so last question for Joseph. Enrollment's not open yet. That's going to be opening August 29th. And that's just Maven's timeline. But if you go to maven.com, you can kind of see some of the courses that are there. And price range, that's still a work in progress. Most Maven courses are between $500 and $1,500 and can range from a 2-day workshop to a 4-week workshop. So definitely want to stay on the lower end of that just to make it more accessible. But if we go to notionbootcamp.com, you can definitely drop in your email and I can follow up with you in terms of, as we're getting closer to launch, what's going to be focused on in the course and details like timing, pricing, things like that. So yeah, and pricing of Manifest is currently, I believe, $67, and we'll probably try to stay within that for the new one. But what I'll do is, reach out to everybody also that attended on when that launches. So yeah, and then if you're curious in the meantime, I drop my email in there to definitely keep in touch. And then one last thing, just so that we stay in touch, if you're on the socials, I'm mostly on Twitter and Instagram, but would love to connect with everybody here. Yeah, and definitely would love to hear your feedback, suggestions, if you've got any ideas for how you're using Notion for business. But in the meantime, I'll see you all hopefully in the next webinar. So thanks so much for joining, and have a great rest of your Thursdays.